This has been a difficult year for Christians in North America. We've had a lot of bad news. In other places, other than Duke Memorial, there has been what some commentators have called an attendance recession, as Americans no longer participate in church at the level that they did in previous years. A recent study by the Pew Research Center found that religion, Christianity, is in difficulty, particularly among the under 30 age group. A recent study has shown that, and a commentator said Catholics are staying away from church because they're angry at the bishops. Evangelicals are staying away from church because they're just angry. And mainline Protestants like us are staying away from church because they are bored. Not good news for us. The Reverend Fred Phelps, who the homophobic hate mongerer, always embarrassing Christians, embarrassed us once again by grabbing the headlines, by dying this year. The last issue of the Christian Century magazine, the cover was, "Will United Methodists Split over Same-Sex Marriage?" And so maybe that's why today, on Easter, there is a particular note of joy as our bells rang out about the resurrection, because we have been producing a lot of bad news lately. But Easter is that great good news made by God. Easter, that great victory that Christ has worked. We thought that the soldiers who crucified Jesus, we thought that the screaming mob, we thought that was the end of the story. But no, there was another chapter yet to be written, and it was written by God. He is risen. He is risen indeed. Not that his resurrection was self-evident to anybody on that first Easter. Mary Magdalene goes out to the tomb. In the Gospel of John, she looks in the tomb. She sees it's empty. And she did not think, "Oh, Jesus is raised from the dead. We have defeated Caesar." No, she thought somebody has stolen the body. And then a little later in the garden, in the darkness, a man meets her. She doesn't know who he is. She thinks he is the gardener, until he calls her name, addresses her, Mary. And then in the darkness, her eyes are open. She sees that Jesus is raised. If you will note in these Easter stories, nobody was an eyewitness to Easter. These are not stories about the drama of a once dead Jesus striding forth out of the tomb. No, these are stories that are stories of the appearances by the resurrected Christ. Easter happens as Christ appears to people who had given up hope. The angel at the tomb says to the women here in Matthew's Gospel, "You're looking for Jesus? Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is risen. He has gone on before you to Galilee." And if you ever ask, why Galilee? I mean, on the first day of your resurrected life, why would you go to Galilee? Galilee, an out-of-the-way, undistinguished sort of place? Well, Galilee is where all of his disciples came from. In Galilee, he's risen. He's gone ahead of you. He's returned to you to Galilee. You would think on the first day of your resurrected life, the risen Christ might go to somewhere important, like up into the palace where Pontius Pilate lived. And he would show himself in his resurrected glory to Pontius Pilate and say, "Oh, Pilate, you made a big mistake. It's payback time." No, doesn't go to Pilate. He doesn't go to Rome before the emperor. He goes to Galilee. And there he appears to the very same people who were his closest friends and his saddest betrayers. he goes first to Galilee. He appears to people who had no hope except for God to do something great. This is the great Easter truth. The great Easter truth is not, first of all, he has come back from the dead, he is risen, we will get to see our loved ones in heaven. But that's a great truth. But the first truth is he is raised and he has returned to sinners like us. Thus John Wesley says, it's a great thing to be able to say God is love, yes. But one really becomes a Christian when one is able to say God is love pro me, for me. Here at this pulpit on Good Friday night, I said, who is God? God is a man hanging on a cross, loving people who did not love him. Well, on Easter Sunday, I can say from this pulpit, who is God? God is a crucified, risen Lord who returned to the very people who did not know how to love him. He came back to us. There's something about this God that refuses to be God without us. There is something about the risen Christ who refuses to rule in heaven without bringing us along. There is our chief hope. Back when I was preaching at Duke Chapel, W.D. Davies, a world-renowned New Testament scholar, taught at the Divinity School, and Dr. Davies flattered me by coming to the chapel and commenting on my sermons. And I remember the Easter, we emerged after a grand service, and he said, before you leave this position, I hope you will preach on the main point of Easter. And I said, have you heard I'm leaving this position? Have you talked to the president? Am I leaving now? And he said, no, but you know, the main thrust of Easter. And I said, how would you describe that? And Dr. Davies said, this is about forgiveness. Maybe that's why the risen Christ keeps saying to his disciples in the Easter story, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of what? Don't be afraid. I love you enough to forgive you for your betrayal. And leaving me, I will not leave you. This is the heart of why we're here. This is the heart of why there is such joy. Back when I was bishop in Alabama, I went out on a Wednesday night to meet with the leadership of what was reputed to be the worst church in Alabama. And I went out there to give them a piece of my mind and to tell them they had already crucified 2 of our pastors. We weren't going to send another one out there till they could learn how to behave. And I went out there, and there were about 8 farmers sitting there. And I told them, I said, this is the worst church in Alabama. And that's saying a lot because we got some bad ones. But let me tell you, no Methodist minister wants to come here to be this pastor. The way you treated your last pastor was just unconscionable. And I went on like that. When I finished, they stared at me in silence. And then one of these farmers said, well, Bishop, if what you say is true, how do you explain that Jesus Christ keeps showing up here every week? I said, that's actually a good point. Easter keeps happening. And the fact that you're here this morning shows that Easter is not just a one-time event. It wasn't that Jesus returned to his 12 best friends who were his 12 worst betrayers. It is that he keeps doing that. He keeps showing up uninvited. He keeps intruding into people's lives who did not ask for his presence, and yet he gave them his presence. Easter keeps happening. The risen Christ keeps reaching out, showing up, calling unreliable people and sending them out on outrageous mission for Him. Paul, when he was in a struggle with one of his little congregations, they must have asked him, "Hey, what gives you the right to tell us how we ought to be the church?" And Paul responded, "The risen Christ appeared to Cephas, and then he appeared to the 12, and then he appeared to a whole throng of people, and then at the very last he appeared even to me." It's kind of the only rationale we have in the face of the world's questioning us or questioning the resurrection. What's your justification for being here this morning? I think it is that in some way in your life, God has figured out how to rise for you. That somehow you figured out that there's this, the love of this God is capable even of reaching out to somebody like you. This God refuses to be God without you. I know as a bishop, I worked hard, I planned, I set goals. We tried to hold clergy accountable for their productivity. We tried to better equip clergy to do the task they were being called to do in the 21st century. But in my better moments, I knew church is not what we produce. Church is not dependent on our faithfulness. Church is whenever the risen Christ shows up. Church is what God does. Back at Duke Chapel, I had a student that I noticed came regularly on Sundays, and so I said to him one Sunday, "Why don't we have lunch together today? Have you got time for lunch?" And he said, "Yeah, I've been wanting to meet with you. That'd be good. I got something I need to tell you." And I said, "Oh, great." So we went out to lunch, and I said, "Jason, tell me a little bit about yourself." And he said, "Well, yeah, that's what I wanted to tell you. I was a teenager from hell. I made my parents' lives miserable when I was in high school." And I said, "Well, that's interesting, but we hear that story around here a lot." So he said, I was bad. He said, "In fact, when I was 16, my parents had me committed to a mental institution." And I said, "Really? I didn't know we had that ability. That's interesting." And he said, "I said I was bad." And he said, "But I broke out of that place in 2 weeks, and I hitchhiked to Chicago. And I got to Chicago, and I started living on the streets." And he said, "I lived on the streets by selling myself to people. And one night, this businessman from out of town, I rolled him, I got his wallet, I took his American Express card, and I went on this binge." And I said, "Gosh, I thought when you said you were bad, you meant that you did stuff with cheerleaders in high school. I didn't, wow, that's bad." And he said, "I said it was bad." And he said, "Well, anyway, the cops got me, and I got sent to Joliet for 8 years." And I said, "Wow, we do not hear that story here at Duke a lot." And he said, and that place was hell. It was like descending to the lowest depths. And he said, "But there was a prisoner. He was in there for life. And he kind of took me under his wing and tried to protect me. And said every night before everybody went to bed, he would read to me a chapter out of the Bible. And I'd never heard the Bible. And I didn't know anything about this. And he wasn't a great reader. And so it took forever for him to get through this chapter of the Bible. Anyway, he was reading through the Gospel of Luke and got there right about the middle of Luke, you know, where Jesus tells that story about the lost coin and the lost boy. And he said, "I guess that was it," but said, I tell you, it was like Jesus Christ just walked into that cell and grabbed hold of me and shoved me against the wall and said, I own you. I got plans for you. He said, it scared me to death. It scared me right out of Joliet prison. I got myself together. I earned my high school degree. I got in Michigan State, but I always wanted to transfer to Duke, so I transferred to Duke, and I'm here on full scholarship. And anyway, I just wanted to tell you that story. And I said, wow, we don't hear that story around here a lot. That's amazing. And he said, well, my point is, you're a preacher, right? And I said, yeah. He said, and I know you preachers, you're always grubbing around for sermon illustrations and all. And I said, yeah. He said, well, look, I'm telling you this because we got Easter coming up. And I just want you to know, I am your proof of Easter. Amen.